following video deals with mature subject matter which may not be suitable for younger children. Viewer discretion is advised.
For over 2 decades, a once obscure monster of First Nations mythology has crept its way into popular entertainment. With its humble beginnings as a villain in X-Men comics, the Wendigo of popular culture has assumed various forms, from its appearance as a rotting anthropomorphic deer in the 2001 film Wendigo, to its portrayal as a pale crawler in the 2015 video game Until Dawn. While most of these modern depictions deviate significantly from that of the archetypal monster of native legend, they maintain the ancient tradition of failing to agree on a universal definition of the Wendigo phenomenon. From the woodland Cree of the boreal forest to the Anishinaabe nations of the Great Lakes, native people across the continent have different conceptions of the cannibal spirit said to haunt the northern wilderness. Some describe it as a towering skeletal giant with tremendous feet, and others as a gaunt, gray-skinned corpse with tattered lips and hollow eyes. Others still regard it as a human being whose heart has turned to ice, endowed with superhuman strength and occult knowledge. Despite their differences, all variations of this dark native legend agree that, whatever their corporeal form, Wendigos are also spiritual beings with the ability to infiltrate the human psyche. People who engage in cannibalism, especially in times of famine, are liable to transform into Wendigos, opening themselves up to the influence of that malevolent, transformative spirit of the North, which instills in its victims an insatiable craving for human meat. In this piece, we will revisit 3 videos on historic Wendigo tales previously published on this channel, which form the as-yet unfinished series, Classic Canadian Wendigo Stories. In the first video, we return to Northern Canadian Wendigo stories, related by Philip H. Godsell, a Hudson's Bay Company inspector who spent the early 20th century traveling from trading post to trading post in Canada's western provinces and northern territories. Next is a detailed description of an 18th century Wendigo encounter on the southern shores of Lake Superior, related by fur trader Alexander Henry the Elder. After that are Wendigo tales set in the North Woods, between Lake Superior and Rainy Lake, told by Irish-Canadian painter and travel writer Paul Kane. In the second segment of this series, we reproduce the chilling Wendigo tales of George Nelson, a fur trader who manned various forts throughout Manitoba and northern Saskatchewan in the early 1800s. Next are the reminiscences of Johan Georg Kohl, a German travel writer who heard old Wendigo stories from French-Canadian voyageurs during his trip to Lake Superior in the 1850s. After that, we recount the gruesome tale of a Wendigo execution made during the Northwest Rebellion of 1885, recorded by the prisoners of a Cree war party during its campaign along the edge of Saskatchewan's boreal forest. In the third and final segment of this ongoing series, we tell the tale of Swift Runner, a Plains Cree hunter executed by the Mounties for an appalling crime he committed, under the influence of Canada's most infamous wilderness demon. Enjoy. One of the oldest, darkest, and most pervasive Canadian folktales is the legend of the Wendigo or Weedigo, an evil cannibalistic spirit of Cree and Algonquin tradition. From the reports of 17th century French Jesuit missionaries who brought the word of God to the Innu of eastern Quebec, to the letters of 19th century fur traders who manned the lonely, frozen outposts of the far north, historic Canadian documents are littered with gruesome anecdotes, illustrating the prevalence of this frightening native tradition on the Canadian frontier. In this author's opinion, Wendigo tales share a certain characteristic with aged cheese, namely that they are best consumed in small quantities. A brief immersion in the red waters of this historical mystery deliciously stimulates the sense of morbid curiosity common to most students of the unexplained. Overindulgence in this folkloric delicacy, on the other hand, could prove unpalatable to readers with a less-than-iron constitution, for reasons which will soon become obvious. Accordingly, this video, which will hopefully be the first of many, will contain only a few short Wendigo stories involving historical characters whose writings this author has referenced in the past. Every illustration in this video was created by my good friend Tom, an American artist whose details and contact information can be found in the description. You can purchase physical prints of any of the illustrations that appear in this video and support Tom and his work in the process by clicking the link in the description. An excellent introduction to the legend of the Wendigo appears in an article entitled Here and There, published in the June 1946 issue of a magazine called The Alberta Folklore Quarterly. The piece was written by Philip H. Godsell, the magazine's editor, and a Canadian folklorist and historian who had spent most of his adult life in northern Canada, working as an inspector for the Hudson's Bay Company. The Wendigo, Godsell wrote, is an evil spirit that enters the body of a sick man, converting him, unless he is destroyed, into a cannibal, endangering the lives of every member of the band. Hardly a spring goes by, but some wandering band of nomad hunters become obsessed with the idea that there is one of these cannibal spirits haunting the outskirts of the camp, anxious to become domiciled within the person of some sick Indian, unquote. Godsell went on to describe an incident that took place at a remote Hudson's Bay Company post at what is now the hamlet of Wabasca, Alberta, located about 85 kilometers or 53 miles northeast of Lesser Slave Lake. One day, the fort's factor, an Orcadian Scot named Frank Beaton, whom Godsell knew well, found himself the unexpected host to a frightened band of Cree Indians. The band's chief informed the fur trader that one of their number had become possessed by a Wendigo, and that strange words were pouring from his lips. Beaton, who was married to a Cree woman, and had spent most of his life in the northern forests, was perfectly familiar with the legend of the Wendigo, and had come to fear that evil spirit of the Northland almost as much as his native neighbors. He agreed with his guests that their only recourse was to destroy the possessed man before he could complete his transformation into a Wendigo and begin devouring members of the band. Loaning them muzzle loaders, powder, and ball, Godsell wrote, he dispatched them on their grisly errand. First, they riddled the poor sick creature with trade bullets. Then, lest the evil spirit again re-enter the body and revive it, they drove a stake through it, deep into the mud floor of the cabin. Finally, to make assurances doubly sure, they set a torch to the building, fired off their guns to drive lurking spirits away, and hurried from the haunted spot. Poor Beaton was in for a hot time afterward when mounted police investigated the affair, and came within an ace of being convicted on a manslaughter charge. Which reminds me, Godsell continued, of another peculiar case. Visiting a Cree camp, I noticed an old, leathery-faced crone, just animated bones in parchment, lying neglected and uncared for on the outskirts of the camp. I gave her some tobacco and tea, which her talon-like hands grabbed with hoarse croaks of delight. I learned from the Indians that she was supposed to be over 115 years old, unquote. The following year, Godsell learned that a medicine man had warned the woman's sons that their mother was possessed by evil spirits which kept her alive. Kindling a huge 10-foot fire of resinous spruce logs, Godsell wrote, they cast this poor creature onto this funeral pyre, alive. Watching till the body was consumed, they raked through the ashes with a stick and found the heart still intact, sure sign that it must have been full of evil, unquote. The sons skewered their mother's heart on a pointed stick and placed it into the fire, watching it intently until it shriveled to a cinder. Only when the heart was completely consumed by fire were they satisfied that their mother's soul was finally at rest. As you travel through the north, Godsell continued, you realize that but a few years ago, when the Indians depended largely upon the caribou and game for sustenance, cannibalism was anything but infrequent in northern Alberta and the Northwest Territories. Looking over old Hudson's Bay journals at Fort Chipewyan on Lake Athabasca, I read of numerous revolting cases of cannibalism on the part of natives driven to desperation by hunger, unquote. Godsell went on to relate the tale of two couriers who mysteriously disappeared several years earlier while delivering mail by dog sled between Fort Norman and Fort Good Hope, two Hudson's Bay Company posts situated on the eastern shores of the Mackenzie River in Canada's Northwest Territories. Starvation stalked the north that year, he wrote. There were no rabbits and few fur-bearing animals, and the weather was bitterly cold. Two old squaws, it was later discovered, had been camped beside the Mackenzie River below Fort Good Hope, and it was noticed when they came into the fort that, in contrast to their emaciated tribesmen, they were looking hardy and well-nourished. Later, they boasted to other Indians that, being on the verge of starvation, they had seen these two male runners plodding along the river and signed to them to come to their warming campfire. The two whites decided to camp there overnight, and after a feed of dried meat, bannock, and tea, rolled themselves in their rabbit-skin robes and fell asleep. Assured that they were sleeping soundly, the two squaws brained them with an axe, cut up the bodies, and consigned them to the pot. One of the squaws complained that one of their victims, a heavy smoker, didn't taste very good." Unquote. Godsell finished his narrative by repeating a tale told to him by Father Emile Petitot, a French oblate missionary who ministered to the spiritual needs of the Hare, Slavey, and Mountain Indians of Fort Norman. While traveling along the shores of Great Bear Lake, Petitot's Dene guide confessed that he had devoured both his mother and sister years earlier, during a severe famine. The missionary, who was well fed at that time, quote, went to bed with a certain amount of mental disquiet and trepidation, but banished it with the realization that there was lots of food in the grub box and lots of caribou around, so it would not be necessary for his guide to indulge his appetite for human flesh. Unquote. 180 years before Philip Godsell's article was published in the Alberta Folklore Quarterly, a fur trader named Alexander Henry the Elder had his own brush with what contemporary natives would almost certainly have designated a Wendigo. Alexander Henry the Elder was one of the first of the so-called peddlers, independent British and New English fur traders who took over the old trading grounds of the French in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War. In 1761, 22-year-old Henry purchased several canoes worth of trading goods in the city of New York, hired a crew of French-Canadian voyageurs in Montreal, and set out for the Great Lakes and the great northwestern wilderness beyond. 2 years into his adventure, Henry became entangled in Pontiac's Rebellion, a violent conflict between the Anishinaabe natives of the Great Lakes and the British Army. Following his capture by Ojibwe warriors, he was rescued by a chief whom he had befriended, and lived among his French-Canadian employees and friendly Ojibwe bands for many years. In the winter of 1766, Henry and his voyageurs left the village of Sault Ste. Marie, where fishing proved uncharacteristically poor, and relocated to what is known today as Keweenaw Bay, at the southern end of Lake Superior. Henry described the incident that ensued in his 1809 autobiography, Tales and Travels in Canada and the Indian Territories between the years 1760 and 1776. Quote, "After being here a fortnight, we were joined by a body of Indians, flying like ourselves from famine. 2 days after, there came a young Indian out of the woods alone, and reporting that he had left the family to which he belonged behind in a starving condition, and unable, from their weakly and exhausted state, to pursue their journey to the bay. The appearance of this youth was frightful, and from his squalid figure there issued a stench which none of us could support. His arrival struck our camp with horror and uneasiness, and it was not long before the Indians came to me, saying they suspected he had been eating human flesh, and even that he had killed and devoured the family which he pretended to have left behind. These charges, upon being questioned, he denied, but not without so much equivocation in his answers as to increase the presumption against him. In consequence, the Indians determined on traveling a day's journey on his track, observing that they should be able to discover from his encampments whether he were guilty or not. The next day they returned, bringing with them a human hand and a skull. The hand had been left roasting before a fire, while the intestines, taken out of the body from which it was cut, hung fresh on a neighboring tree. The youth, being informed of these discoveries and further questioned, confessed the crime of which he was accused. From the account he now proceeded to give, it appeared that the family had consisted of his uncle and aunt, their 4 children, and himself. One of the children was a boy of 15 years of age. His uncle, after firing at several beasts of the chase, all of which he missed, fell into despondence, and persuaded himself that it was the will of the Great Spirit that he should perish. In this state of mind, he requested his wife to kill him. The woman refused to comply, but the 2 lads, one of them, as has been said, the nephew, and the other the son of the unhappy man, agreed between themselves to murder him, to prevent, as our informant wished us to believe, his murdering them. Accomplishing their detestable purpose, they devoured the body, and famine pressing upon them still closer, they successively killed the 3 younger children, upon whose flesh they subsisted for some time, and with a part of which the parricides at length set out for the lake, leaving the woman, who was too feeble to travel, to her fate. On their way, their foul victuals failed. The youth before us killed his companion, and it was a part of the remains of this last victim that had been discovered at the fire. The Indians entertain an opinion that the man who has once made human flesh his food will never afterward be satisfied with any other. It is probable that we saw things in some measure through the medium of our prejudices, but I confess that this distressing object appeared to verify the doctrine. He ate with relish nothing that was given him, but, indifferent to the food prepared, fixed his eyes continually on the children who were in the Indian lodge, and frequently exclaimed, "How fat they are!" It was perhaps not unnatural that, after long acquaintance with no human form but such as was gaunt and pale from want of food, a man's eyes should be almost riveted upon anything where misery had not made such inroads, and still more upon the bloom and plumpness of childhood. And the exclamation might be the most innocent, and might proceed from an involuntary and unconquerable sentiment of admiration. Be this as it may, his behavior was considered, and not less naturally, as marked with the most alarming symptoms, and the Indians, apprehensive that he would prey upon their children, resolved on putting him to death. They did this the next day with a single stroke of an axe, aimed at his head from behind, and of the approach of which he had not the smallest intimation." Unquote. "80 years after Alexander Henry's disturbing experience on the southern shores of Lake Superior, an Irish-Canadian named Paul Kane heard a similar story west of that same lake, on what is known today as the Namakan River. Inspired by American artist Georg, who painted hundreds of portraits of American Indians during an epic journey up the Mississippi and Missouri rivers in the 1830s, Kane decided to travel across Canada and immortalize the characters and scenes he encountered on canvas. In 1846, he accompanied a Hudson's Bay Company fur brigade across the continent, from Lake Superior to Fort Vancouver in what is now the American state of Washington. The first leg of Kane's journey was a succession of portage trails and water routes between Lake Superior and westerly Rainy Lake. On June 1st, 1846, near the end of this stretch, Kane and his companions came upon a Saulteaux Indian and his wife, from whom they purchased some dried sturgeon. In his 1859 travel memoir, Wanderings of an Artist Among the Indians of North America, Kane wrote that his French-Canadian voyageur companions subsequently informed him that the couple with whom they had just traded were believed to be Wendigos, or those who eat human flesh. There is a superstitious belief among the Indians, Kane wrote, that a Wendigo cannot be killed by anything short of a silver bullet. I was informed, on good authority, that a case had occurred here in which a father and daughter had killed and eaten 6 of their own family from absolute want. The story went on to state that they then encamped at some distance off in the vicinity of an old Indian woman, who happened to be alone in her lodge, her relations having gone out hunting. Seeing the father and daughter arrive unaccompanied by any other members of the family, all of whom she knew, she began to suspect that some foul play had taken place, and began to feel apprehensive for her own safety. By way of precaution, she resolved to make the entrance to her lodge very slippery, and as it was winter, and the frost severe, she poured water repeatedly over the ground as fast as it froze, until it was covered with a mass of smooth ice. And instead of going to bed, she remained sitting up in her lodge, watching with an axe in her hand. When near midnight, she heard steps advancing cautiously over the crackling snow, and looking through the crevices of the lodge, caught sight of the girl in the attitude of listening, as if to ascertain whether the inmate was asleep. This the old woman feigned by snoring aloud. This welcome sound no sooner reached the ears of the wretched girl than she rushed forward, but slipping on the ice, fell down at the entrance of the lodge, whereupon the intended victim sprang upon the murderess and buried the axe in her brains. And not doubting but the villainous father was near at hand, she fled with all her speed to a distance to escape his vengeance. In the meantime, the Wendigo father, who was impatiently waiting for the expected signal to his horrid repast, crept up to the lodge and called to his daughter. Hearing no reply, he went on, and in place of the dead body of the old woman, he saw his own daughter. And hunger overcoming every other feeling, he saved his own life by devouring her remains. The Wendigos are looked upon with superstitious dread and horror by all Indians, and anyone known to have eaten human flesh is shunned by the rest, as it is supposed that, having once tasted it, they would do so again had they the opportunity. They are obliged, therefore, to make their lodges at some distance from the rest of the tribe, and the children are particularly kept out of their way. However, they are not molested or injured in any way, but rather seem to be pitied for the misery they must have endured before they could be brought to this state. I do not think that any Indian, at least none that I have seen, would eat his fellow creature, except under the influence of starvation. Nor do I think that there was any tribe of Indians on the North American continent to whom the word cannibal can be properly applied." Unquote. Ancient native legend has it that an evil, man-eating entity prowls the woods of eastern Canada, the timberland of the Canadian Shield, and the forests of the Canadian North. For centuries, tales of these North American ghouls were the exclusive domain of lonely Indian campfires, the letters and journals of frontiersmen, and the ethnologies of academics with special interests in the lore of the boreal forests. Native people called this creature the Wendigo, or the Wetiko, a word which translates to cannibal. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, this disturbing oral tradition gradually made its way into popular literature, film, and video games. Today, the Wendigo is typically depicted as either a rotting anthropomorphic deer, or a gaunt, long-limbed humanoid, which crawls on all fours like a spider. The original native portrait of the Wendigo varied from place to place and from nation to nation. Despite their differences, however, most traditional interpretations of that monstrous, man-eating menace of the North bear little resemblance to their modern incarnations. In this video, we'll take a look at some classic Canadian Wendigo stories from the 1800s in an effort to form a clearer picture of this great North American monster. Every illustration in this video was created by my good friend Tom, an American artist who is very passionate about his craft. Less than a month ago, Tom started up his own YouTube channel called An Abstract Look, on which he renders the flavors and textures of American fast food into abstract paintings. So if you'd like to see what the essence of Taco Bell's Crunchwrap Supreme looks like on canvas, or if you'd like to see how Tom goes about his work, please check out his YouTube channel, An Abstract Look, which you can find by clicking the link in the description. One cold spring night in May 1823, in a lonely lakeside cabin in the wooded heart of what is now northern Saskatchewan, a veteran fur trader named Georg Nelson sat down by candlelight to write a long letter to his father. Georg Nelson was in the twilight of a long and frustrating career that spanned the entirety of his adult life, beginning in 1802, when he signed on as a clerk with a small fur trading syndicate at the age of 15. He had served 3 different fur trading companies, namely the XY Company, the Northwest Company, and the Hudson's Bay Company, being forced to work alongside former rivals as each syndicate was absorbed by its successor. He cut his teeth in the forests of Wisconsin, living among his Ojibwe clients, who were on the perpetual run from their easterly enemies, the Dakota Sioux. He spent nearly 2 decades serving at various posts along the southern and western shores of Lake Winnipeg, in what is now the province of Manitoba. And in 1822, after 2 decades of service, he was transferred to a remote outpost on the shores of Lac La Ronge, deep in the frozen forests of northern Saskatchewan. Being of loyalist New English stock and Protestant persuasion, he had never quite established rapport with the Scottish clansmen who populated the upper management of the syndicates for which he worked, nor with the Catholic French-Canadian voyageurs under his charge. His lack of connections likely precluded his professional advancement. At the time of his transfer to Lac La Ronge, Georg Nelson still retained the lowly position of clerk. In a lengthy series of letters to his father, penned throughout the spring and summer of 1823, George Nelson set to paper some of the beliefs and customs of the Cree and Ojibwe with whom he had traded for 20 years. This fascinating correspondence, which has been described as one of the finest early ethnographic documents of its kind, is peppered with strange tales of ghosts, Indian magic, and some of Nelson's own unexplainable experiences in the wilderness of North America. Among the strangest of these stories are those which pertain to the legend of the Wendigo. Nelson introduced this frightening native tradition in one of his letters, writing, "There is a kind of disease peculiar to the Crees and Sotos, and of which they have the greatest dread and horror, and certainly not without the very greatest cause. The consequences 49 times out of 50 being death, unfortunately, to many besides the subjects or objects themselves. They term this Wendigo, the proper signification of which is giant. Suffice it to say that the Wendigo are of uncommon size. Goliath is an unborn infant to them, their head reaching the tops of the highest poplars, about 70 or 80 feet. They are of proportionate size. Of course they must be very heavy. Their gait, though grand and majestic, at every step the earth shakes. They frequently pursue their prey invisibly, yet they cannot so completely divest themselves of all the incommodities of nature as to prevent their approach being known. A secret and unaccountable horror pervades the whole system of one, several, or the whole band of those of whom he is in pursuit. These giants, as far as I can learn, reside somewhere about the North Pole, and even at this day frequently pay their unwelcome visits. It seems also that they delegate their power to the Indians occasionally, and this occasions that cannibalism proceeds from a sort of distemper much resembling mania." Nelson went on to describe how, in the boreal forest, where the natives lead a nomadic lifestyle and subsist on game, men frequently went hungry. Out of desperation, some starving Indians were known to occasionally break their gravest cultural taboo and feed upon the flesh of the dead. "I believe that those who have once preyed upon their fellows," Nelson wrote, "ever after feel a great desire for the same nourishment, and are not so scrupulous about the means of procuring it. I have seen several that have been reduced to this disturbing alternative, and though many years after, there appeared to me a wildness in their eyes, a confusion in their countenances, much resembling that of reprieved murderers." Nelson went on to relate several chilling anecdotes, illustrating the mysterious craving for human flesh, sometimes acquired by those who condescended to cannibalism. According to one story, sometime in the late 1810s, prior to Nelson's arrival in the country, a strange Indian woman paid a visit to the trading post at Lac La Ronge. Her appearance was haggard, wild, and distressed, Nelson wrote. However, she was taken into the house, questions put as usual, but the answers vague, indefinite, and contradictory. The traders gave the woman some good food, but although she appeared to be ravenous, she only feigned eating, slipping morsels down the neck of her gown. This roused suspicion, Nelson wrote, but what added to this was the extraordinary stench she emitted. The traders' suspicions were confirmed when one of their dogs dragged a ragged human shoulder blade in from the trail on which the woman had traveled. Horrified, yet lacking sufficient evidence that the woman had committed any crime, they directed their unwanted visitor to a nearby Cree camp. As soon as she made her appearance, Nelson wrote, the Indians immediately conceived what was the matter, but through charity as well as for safety and to find the truth, they gave her to eat, principally marrow fat. The woman refused this hospitality. She proceeded to kiss and embrace her host's children, as was customary among the Cree, and was unable to conceal the voracious appetite that this courtesy aroused in her. That night, the men of the household kept a watchful eye on their guest, sleeping with their weapons close at hand. Sure enough, the woman quietly rose from her furs in the dead of night, and crept over to one of the sleeping children. One of the men perceived this. Before the woman could do any harm, he seized a tomahawk and buried it in her brains. Nelson appeared to imply that, despite the devastating blow which the Indian administered, the woman began to attack him, and would have succeeded in killing him had his companions not leapt to his defense and put an end to her existence. Engaging in cannibalism was not the only way by which people made themselves vulnerable to the influence of the Wendigo. Anyone who happened to dream of the far north, or of a land filled with ice, was in danger of falling under the Wendigo's spell. In such dreams, the dreamer would often be invited to partake in a feast of fowl, or some other wild game that had been prepared for him. The wary dreamer, upon examining the victuals more closely, would find that the game he was enticed to eat was actually human flesh. Those who failed to recognize the true nature of the meal would, after eating their fill, be informed that they were doomed to become cannibals, and were advised that a particular sign, like children eating snow indoors, would portend their imminent transformation. A young Indian, a few years back, had one of the above dreams, wrote Nelson later on in the same letter. Noticing that the dreams seemed to be occurring more frequently, and with greater intensity, the Indian implored his friends to kill him if they ever perceived the slightest sign of his transforming into a Wendigo, warning them that he might soon become too strong for them to kill. He had been a good hunter and a peaceable Indian, Nelson wrote, and of course much loved by his friends. This business depressed them a great deal. Nevertheless, acceding to his wishes, the band members developed a plan by which to execute him. One day, the entire band packed their belongings and moved camp, as the Cree routinely did from time to time. On some pretense, the brother of the afflicted man convinced the latter to remain with them in the old camp for some time. Eventually, the brother declared that the band must have finished pitching their new camp, and suggested that the two of them rejoin them. The brother set off up the trail at a jog, leaving the sick man trailing behind him. When he was certain the afflicted man could no longer see him, the brother concealed himself in the brush, loaded and primed his musket, and waited for the Wendigo to be, hoping to ambush him on the trail. This was a preconceived scheme, Nelson wrote. The other men, of course, were not far off. The sick one drew near, in a very slow and thoughtful manner. However, when he came near to where his brother was hid, he stopped, looked up, and called out, "Thou thinkest thyself well hid from me, my brother, but I see thee. It is well thou undertakest. It had been better for thee, however, hadst thou began sooner. Remember what I told you all. It is my heart that is terrible. And however you may injure my body, if you do not completely annihilate my heart, nothing is done." The brother was certain that the sick man could not possibly have noticed him, so well was he camouflaged, and suspected that the knowledge of his presence was proof that his brother had acquired preternatural abilities as a result of his affliction. Convinced that the time had come, he emerged from his hiding place, raised his musket, and shot the sick man in the chest, aiming for his heart. The musket ball passed straight through the man's body, and the sick man dropped to his knees. To his brother's astonishment, however, the afflicted rose to his feet immediately, and continued on up the trail, laughing as he walked. The brother observed that not a single drop of blood oozed from the sick man's wound, and took it as an indication that his heart had turned to ice, as was said to happen to those possessed by the spirit of the Wendigo. At the report of the musket, the other hunters of the band rushed to the scene. Seeing the sick man alive and unharmed, they hacked him to pieces with their ice picks and tomahawks. According to his desire, Nelson wrote, they had collected a large pile of dry wood and laid him upon it. The body was soon consumed, but the heart remained perfect and entire. It rolled several times off the pile. They replaced it as often. Fear seized them. Then with their ice chisels, they cut and hacked it into small bits, but yet with difficulty was it consumed. In 1855, 32 years after Nelson wrote his letters, a German travel writer named Johan Georg Kohl heard his own Wendigo stories on the shores of Lake Superior, which he included in his 1859 travel memoir, Kichigami, Wanderings Round Lake Superior. In his book, Kohl wrote, "It is pretty generally accepted and allowed that the Indian North American tribes are not anthropophagists, anthropophagites being eaters of human flesh, and have never been so. Still, as I have just mentioned, owing to their barbarous war habits and wild thirst for revenge, they will sometimes sin by swallowing human flesh. It frequently happens, too, in these barren and poor countries, that men are so reduced by hunger and want that in their despair they shoot down their fellow men like game and eat them in the same way. My ears still tingle with the tragic stories I heard of an Indian who killed his 2 squaws and then his children in succession, of another who murdered his friend, of a third who wandered about the forests like a hungry wolf and hunted his fellow men. Stories one of which happened in 1854 on Isle Royale, another on the north bank of the lake. The third occurred somewhere else in the neighborhood, and were told to me in their fullest details. But even these cases of unnatural attacks on one's own brethren, produced by unspeakable want, are only exceptions to a rule. The Indians here, on the contrary, have always returned to a state of natural repugnance against cannibalism, and they have, indeed, a decided aversion from those who have committed the crime, even when in extreme want, and almost in a state of rabid frenzy. They give them the opprobrious name of Wendigo, which is nearly synonymous with our cannibal, and it is quite certain that if a man has ever had recourse to this last and most horrible method of saving his life, even when the circumstances are pressing and almost excusable, he is always regarded with terror and horror by the Indians. They avoid him, and he lives among the savages like a timid head of game. Anyone that has once broken through the bounds does so easily again, or at least the supposition is rife that he can do so. Hence he becomes an object of apprehension, and must live retired from the rest of his fellow men. He does not enjoy their fraternal assistance, and thus his hostile position towards society soon drives him back into the same difficulty and temptation. In this manner, or nearly so, a class of Wendigos is called into existence. I was told of a man who wandered about in the forests on the northern bank of the lake. He was known perfectly well, and his name was even mentioned to me. I learned that during a hard winter, he had killed and eaten his squaw. After that, he had attacked, killed, and also devoured a girl. This man always went about hunting by himself, and whenever his canoe was seen, the sight produced terror and alarm, and all the world fled from him. He was equally a burden to himself as to the others, and in consequence of all the agony he endured, he had fallen into a state of brooding melancholy and a fearful affection of the brain. The murder of his wife was the result of a state of delirium produced by his sufferings, and now, report added, his brain was quite softened, and the sutures of his temple had begun to give way. He was regularly hunted down, so people said, and he would before long receive a vengeful bullet from society. It is a universal tradition among the Indians that in the primitive ages there were anthropophagus giants called Wendigos. The people's fancy is so busy with them, as well as with the isolated cases of real cannibalism, that they begin to dream of them, and these dreams here and there degenerate to such a point that a man is gained over to the idea that he is fated to be a Wendigo. Such dreams vary greatly. At times, a man will merely dream that he must kill so many persons during his life. Another dream adds that he must also devour them. And as these strange beings believe in their dreams as they do in the stars, they act in accordance with their gloomy suggestions. The Wendigo mania rarely breaks out spontaneously. It must have its predecessors and degrees. If a man lives much apart and out of the world, if he appear to be melancholy and is tortured by evil dreams, then people begin to fear he may end up becoming a Wendigo, and he is himself attacked by the fatalistic apprehensions, and is driven towards a gloomy fate. At times, when a man is quarreling with his wife, he will say, "Squaw, take care. Thou wilt drive me too far that I will turn Wendigo." They believe that the Wendigos have an understanding with the evil spirits who help them. Hence, a Wendigo can go on for a long time before the punishment fall on him and the avenger appear. They imagine that a real Wendigo is very difficult to kill, and that, in order to destroy him thoroughly, he must be torn to pieces. Otherwise, he may easily come to life again. There are also Wendigo women, des femmes Wendigo, in Indian, Wendigoque. A Canadian voyageur of the name Lariche was once busy fishing near his hut. He had set one net and was making another on the beach. All at once, when he looked up, he saw, to his terror, a strange woman, an old witch, une femme Wendigo, standing in the water near his net. She was taking out the fish he had just caught and eating them raw. Lariche, in his horror, took up his gun and killed her on the spot. Then his squaws ran out of the adjoining wigwam and shouted, "Nish." This was the name Lariche had received, as the Indians cannot pronounce the letter R. "Nish, cut her up at once, or else she'll come to life again, and we shall all fare ill." I do not know where Lariche obtained his firm conviction that the old woman he shot was really a femme Wendigo, but it seems as if people's eyes and minds were practiced here in the matter, for another half-breed told me how he met a Wendigo and fired on him at once like a rattlesnake. "I was once shooting ducks in that swamp," he said, as he pointed to a bed of reeds. "I fancied I was alone, but suddenly, while aiming at a brace of ducks, I saw a Wendigo crouching in the reeds. I recognized him at once, and knew that he had come down from the interior to the lake. He had been going about for some time in our neighborhood, and he was said to have killed 2 men already. He had his gun to his shoulder, and was aiming at me, just as I was doing to the ducks. On seeing this, I did not make any sign that I had recognized him, but walked quietly on towards my ducks. He hesitated about firing, probably in the hope that I should soon stand still. I took advantage of the interval, squinted round for my gun, made sure of his position, and suddenly turning, I shot him down. His charge went off harmlessly in the air, but he soon picked himself up and disappeared in the reeds, for I had merely wounded him. I had not the courage to follow him, but he soon left these parts over the ice, for it was winter. We followed his blood trail for some distance, and afterwards a report spread that he had fallen through the ice on his flight, and had perished. The country we know today as Canada changed dramatically in the decades following Kohl's visit to Lake Superior. 3 British provinces, which comprise much of what is now eastern and central Canada, amalgamated into an autonomous dominion of the British Empire in 1867. In 1874, this fledgling Dominion of Canada dispatched the Northwest Mounted Police to the westerly prairies to establish law and order. From 1881 to 1885, the Canadian Pacific Railway built a great transcontinental railroad from the Easterly Dominion across the prairies to the western province of British Columbia, which had joined Canadian Confederation in 1871. And in 1885, following the construction of that great iron thoroughfare, hordes of homesteaders began to settle the wild country of the Canadian interior, which had hitherto served as the hunting grounds of Canada's First and Métis nations. Many of the native and Métis inhabitants of the Canadian interior were horrified at the changes that were swiftly reshaping the face of their ancestral homeland. The Métis being particularly alarmed by the Dominion's attempts to survey the land on which they kept their independent homesteads, and the natives, especially the Plains Cree, being dismayed by the rapid disappearance of the buffalo on which their ancestors had relied for centuries. In the spring of 1885, a corps of Métis militiamen in what is now central Saskatchewan, and a war party of Plains Cree braves in what is now east-central Alberta, respectively, gave violent vent to their frustration. The Métis by engaging a squadron of Northwest Mounted Policemen in the Battle of Loon Lake, and the Plains Cree by slaughtering a community of settlers in the Massacre of Frog Lake, touching off a 2-month-long conflict known as the Northwest Rebellion. The Plains Cree rebels imprisoned a handful of white and Métis settlers who had survived the bloodshed at Frog Lake, and dragged them along their campaign trail skirting the edge of the boreal forest. 4 of these prisoners, namely widows Teresa Gowanlock and Teresa Delaney, Hudson's Bay Company clerk William Cameron, and Métis interpreter Louis Goulet, later described their ordeal in their memoirs. In late May 1885, an elderly Plains Cree woman who had accompanied the war party began to exhibit signs of what her fellow band members suspected to be Wendigo possession. The strange episode and its grisly conclusion was described by the aforementioned writers, its more gruesome details appearing in the memoirs of Cameron and Goulet. "You folks there, you don't know what a Wendigo is, do you?" began Goulet in his description of the event. "Well, listen, and you'll see it's no joke. First of all, the word Wendigo means cannibal. The Indians believe that when a person is about to turn Wendigo, he or she lets out a scream, and anybody within earshot is paralyzed. You don't even have to hear it, because it's not the Wendigo's fault if people don't hear. You just have to be close enough, that's all it takes. The Wendigo's scream paralyzes people, and that's how he can eat a whole camp, even if it takes a month or two to swallow everybody. That's not the most serious part of the whole business, though. When a person shows Wendigo symptoms, he must be killed before the change actually takes place, because it's difficult to kill a full-fledged Wendigo. They have hearts of ice, and the power to rejoin parts of their body, and come back to life, even after their head's been cut off, and they've been hacked to pieces. The best way to get rid of them is to have a Catholic kill them, or else load the gun with some kind of holy object. Now, during the time we were camped in the Spruce Bluff, an old lady started ranting and raving in a fever, telling her daughter that if somebody didn't do away with her, she'd turn Wendigo after the sun went down. Well, let me tell you, those Indians were scared, and with good reason. Just think of it, a Wendigo in the camp. Quick, somebody had to kill the old woman right away before she changed over. William Cameron described the same event in his own memoir, Blood Red the Sun, relating how he first learned of the Wendigo woman while smoking and eating with his friend Lone Man, a Cree from Frog Lake, who had been bullied into joining the war party. I noticed Big Bear's men unusually in evidence, Cameron wrote, Big Bear being the head chief of the Plains Cree, carrying their guns and wearing grave faces. An ominous quiet reigned. When his tribal friends were gone, I asked Lone Man to enlighten me. Well, he said, you have heard of the old woman in camp who wants to eat human flesh. She says if she isn't dead before the sun goes out tonight, she cannot be killed, and will then begin to eat the children. They are afraid. She has but half a smoke to live. Come, we will go and see her. At the farther end of the camp, we came to a lodge around which were grouped many of Big Bear's warriors. Wandering Spirit, in full dress, was there with his Winchester. His look was inexorable, relentless. Four Sky Thunder stood near him. The doomed woman, the Wendigo, was crouched on the floor of the lodge groaning and mumbling to herself, a poor demented creature, a helpless, aged, and ailing imbecile. We had tried to persuade the Indians that nothing serious was wrong, that she could do them no harm. We saw now unavailingly. She was seated on the ground, Indian fashion, wrote Goulet of the Wendigo woman, with her legs crossed. Nothing but skin and bones. Probably less than 100 pounds of her. She was delirious. Just from the look of her, we decided she wasn't dangerous enough to need chaining up. But the Indians, they weren't so sure. So we had to take every possible precaution and chained her before we took her out. Goulet and Cameron described how the woman was taken from her teepee, placed on a stretcher, and carried half a mile from the camp, where she was placed under a clump of willows. According to Goulet, a Métis prisoner named André New was originally ordered to carry out the execution. With shaking hands he loaded his musket, using a woman's scapular, a necklace bearing 2 square pieces of cloth, which serves as a token of Christian devotion, as wadding. New eventually declared himself too nervous to carry out the operation properly, and the grim task was appointed to 2 Cree warriors, a boy named Wassagamek, or Bright Eyes, and a man named Wawasehuin, or Dressy Man, as well as an old Métis named Charles Ducharme, who was nicknamed Charlebois. It was decided that Charlebois would deliver the killing blow. The Métis executioner prepared for the ordeal by painting his legs and the lower half of his face black with charcoal, giving himself the appearance of a real demon, according to Goulet. Seizing a heavy Cree war club, Charlebois gave a short speech in which he declared himself innocent of the crime he was about to commit. He placed a shawl over the head of the old woman, who was sitting cross-legged, apparently unaware of her surroundings, and muttering under her breath that she would soon turn Wendigo. Charlebois then whirled the war club above his head, brought it down in a swift arc, and delivered a terrible blow to the old woman's temple. The woman fell on her side, stiff and trembling in every limb, blood gushing from her mouth. Young Bright Eyes quickly stepped forward with his rifle and shot 3 bullets into her skull and body. Finally, Dressy Man, armed with a Mountie officer's saber he had taken as a war trophy at Frog Lake, severed the woman's head with a single powerful stroke. Then, Goulet wrote, clutching it by the braids, he tried to throw the head over the clump of willows, but the braids caught in the branches, and the head stayed hanging there, with its hideous face swinging 3 or 4 feet above the ground, striking blind terror into the Indians, who ran away as fast as their legs would take them, without risking so much as a backward glance. Without a doubt, the old woman was dead, decapitated, but the gruesome business was still only half done, because the head must, at all costs, be prevented from reuniting with the torso, or the old woman could come to life again, even more dangerous than before. We made a pile of dry branches all around and over the body, placing the head on the pile, and covering it with a second layer of dry branches. Then the whole works was set blazing. William Cameron concluded his account of the affair, the lurid climax of which he did not witness himself, by stating, "The superstitious savages were determined there should be no possibility of the resurrection of the Wendigo." It was the morning of December 20th, 1879. The blanket of snow covering the frozen surface of the North Saskatchewan River was crisscrossed by snowshoe prints and dog tracks, which converged like the spokes of a wheel on Fort Saskatchewan, a Northwest Mounted Police post located about a day's journey downriver from the old Hudson's Bay Company's Fort Edmonton. In the grey gloom of the winter twilight, in the prison yard enclosed by the fort's newly constructed palisade, amid swirling snow, loitered about 100 Cree and Métis trappers, many of whom were huddled around a fire they had kindled the previous night from the trap door of the gallows that loomed nearby. They had come to witness the execution of one of their kinsmen, the first formal hanging in the region known at the time as the Northwest Territories. Also in attendance was the fort's 20-man garrison, whose officers stood at attention in coats made from buffalo robes they had appropriated from whiskey traders just a few years earlier. Sheriff Edward Richard, who had trudged in from easterly Fort Battleford, a grueling snowshoe journey of about 500 kilometers or 300 miles up the North Saskatchewan River, and Reverend Fathers René Remus and Hippolyte Leduc, French Oblate priests from the nearby Catholic missions at Lac La Biche and Lac Sainte-Anne, respectively. Father Leduc stood on the scaffold platform, his long black robe affording him scant protection against the bone-chilling temperature, which hovered around minus 40 degrees Celsius that morning. Minus 40 degrees Celsius, incidentally, also being minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite the cold, the priest later recalled that perspiration flowed freely down his temples and back, his whole body being inflamed by the somber excitement of the occasion. Beside him stood a nervous old Métis soldier named Rogers, who had volunteered as hangman, and the condemned man, a powerfully built, roughly 40-year-old, 6'3" Cree hunter named Swift Runner, his hands pinioned in front of him, and his neck girded by the noose. At the Duke's prompting, Swift Runner calmly addressed the crowd that had come to watch him die, thanking the Mountie Guards, to whose care he had been committed since his arrest the previous spring, for the kind treatment they had shown him, and expressing regret for his misdeeds, to which he freely admitted. When it became clear that the big native had said all he wished to say, the priest began to pray aloud in Latin, and the Cree onlookers broke into wailing death songs in their own language. At the height of this eerie cacophony, the hangman drew the bolt, plunging Swift Runner into eternity, and delivering justice for one of the most stomach-churning crimes ever committed on Albertan soil. The story of Swift Runner is a patchwork of various primary and secondary sources, many of which contain details which are completely inconsistent with each other. Over the years, a handful of researchers have stitched these incongruities together into flowing chronologies, like those found in J.P. Turner's 1950 book, The Northwest Mounted Police, T.W. Patterson's 1982 book, Outlaws of Western Canada, Colin Thompson's 1984 book, Swift Runner, and Chad Lewis and Kevin Lee Nelson's 2020 book, Wendigo Lore. In addition to contemporary newspaper articles, most of them unsatisfactorily brief, some of the best early sources on the Swift Runner story include the testimony of Father Leduc, who visited Swift Runner continually in the days leading up to his execution, in a heroic effort to save his eternal soul from damnation. 3 days prior to the hunter's execution, Leduc heard Swift Runner's full confession during the Sacrament of Reconciliation, and received his permission to share his ghastly tale with the world. Leduc's testimony was printed in various newspapers across Canada and the United States, first appearing in the February 9, 1880 issue of Fort Battleford's Saskatchewan Herald. The article The Last of Canada's Cannibals by Major Fred Bagley, published in the July 1942 issue of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Quarterly magazine, just 3 years prior to the author's death. Bagley was one of the original officers of the Northwest Mounted Police, and the youngest recruit to join the force, beginning his career as a constable and bugler at the tender age of 15. He accompanied the force on its epic 1874 march west across the prairies, and had helped build the stockade at Fort Saskatchewan in the spring of 1879. Bagley guarded Swift Runner during his incarceration, and often conversed with the prisoner in his native Cree, a language which he had picked up during his 5 years of service in the Northwest Territories. The night before his hanging, Swift Runner, or Kaki Sikuchin, as Bagley referred to him, using his Cree name, presented him with his smoking pipe and his tabiskagan, the latter being a beaded and furred neckpiece, which doubled as a scarf and talisman. The 1882 book, 6 Years in the Canadian Northwest, written by Jean d'Artigue, another original officer of the Northwest Mounted Police, who was present at Swift Runner's execution. The courtroom transcript of Swift Runner's trial, which can be found in Ottawa, Ontario's Library and Archives, Canada. And a lengthy and arguably questionable article headlined, An Indian Murderer and Cannibal, Horrible Crimes in the Northwest of Canada, which was first published in the January 15, 1880 issue of the Ottawa Daily Citizen. This piece furnishes details which appear in no other contemporary testimony, some of which conflict directly with Father Leduc's narrative. Minutiae drawn from this article have been echoed throughout the 20th and 21st centuries in succeeding accounts of this true Canadian horror story. Despite a valiant attempt by writer Colin Thompson to formulate a plausible backstory for the villain of our tale, little is known about Swift Runner's early life. According to a brief, colorful, and perhaps dubious biography contained within the article from the Ottawa Daily Citizen, Swift Runner was once the chief of a small band of Plains Cree that haunted the North Saskatchewan River, regularly trading in their furs for guns, tea, and flour at Fort Edmonton. In 1875, the Hudson's Bay Company traders, with whom he had built rapport, recommended him as a trustworthy and intelligent guide to the officers of the Northwest Mounted Police, who were beginning to establish their own outposts through what is now central Alberta. His career as a police scout, however, was short-lived on account of his appetite for whiskey, an illicit commodity which nonetheless found its way into the country, slipping past Mountie patrols. Swift Runner became inordinately fond of it, the article proclaimed, referring to bootlegged liquor, and when half drunk, was the terror of the whole region. 6 feet and 3 in height, and of extraordinary strength, he was an ugly customer to meet when on a spree, and the police gave him a wide berth on such occasions. At length, his conduct grew so outrageously bad that they sent him back to his tribe, but his old habits clung to him, and he turned the Cree camps into little hells. The portrait of Swift Runner as an alcoholic menace conflicts with his portrayal by RCMP historian J.P. Turner in his official 1950 history of the Northwest Mounted Police. Of good character, Turner wrote of the strapping Cree hunter, he was mild and trustworthy, a considerate husband, and exceedingly fond of his children. But Swift Runner suffered abnormally from troubled dreams, one of the most insidious curses of Indian life. He was continually seeing, or thinking he saw, some of the spirits which were wont to haunt every Indian mind. Foremost among these was the Wendigo, the cannibal spirit, urging him to indulge in cannibalism. The Wendigo to which Turner referred is a preternatural monster of Cree and Algonquin legend, also referred to as the Wendigo, Witico, or Wendigo, depending on the tribal affiliation of the storyteller. In his 1982 article, Wendigo Psychosis, published in the August 1982 issue of Current Anthropology, anthropologist Lou Moreno explained, "When speaking of the Wendigo, we may distinguish at least 3 categories. The first is a Wendigo as superhuman monsters, who may or may not have had human antecedents. The second is a category of human beings, the members of which may or may not have been considered to have been possessed by the spirit of the cannibal monster. The third category is a culture-specific psychotic syndrome, the victims of which are obsessed by a compulsive desire to eat human flesh." Moreno directed readers interested in acquainting themselves with the first category of Wendigo the corporeal demon from which derive the second and third categories of this nebulous boreal terror, to read the article Witico Among the Tête de Boule, written by Oblate missionary Reverend Joseph E. Guinard, and published in the July to October 1930 issue of the journal Primitive Man. The Witico, Guinard wrote, among the Tête de Boule, an Algonquian-speaking people of the upper St. Maurice River, Quebec, is a fabulous monster, a species of giant cannibalistic man. The older people speak to the children about this evil being in veiled language and in hushed voice, as if to fool him, and as if he must not know they are speaking of him. The Witico wore no clothing. Summer and winter, he went naked and never suffered cold. His skin was black like that of a Negro. The Witico had no lips. His mouth was frightful and menacing. His breath passed through his enormous crooked teeth with a sinister hissing. The Witico's eyes were big and rolled in blood. They were something like an owl's eyes. His feet, which were nearly a yard long, had only one toe, the big toe. His heels were very long and pointed. The hands of the Witico were hideous, and the fingers and fingernails were like the claws of the great mountain bears. The voice of the Witicos was strident and frightful, and more reverberating than thunder. The sound of his voice was a long, drawn-out one, accompanied by fearful howls. When the people heard it, everyone fled to the woods and swamps, looking for a safe place to hide. The strength of the Witicos is prodigious. With one stroke or twist of the hand, they could disembowel dogs or men. Neither arrows, nor axes, nor anything on earth could kill them. It was almost impossible to escape from Witicos. They seemed to be able to foresee and to know beforehand where their victims had gone. It was of this monster that Swiftrunner was said to have dreamed, a sure sign, according to Cree tradition, that he would soon fall under its diabolical spell. According to Fred Bagley, the native attributed the onset of these nocturnal reveries to an event that took place during a hunting trip in the far north, deep in the boreal forest, which he made years earlier in the company of a young boy. Instead of filling their packs with moose and bear meat, as they had anticipated, Swiftrunner and his young companion were unable to find any game, and became desperately hungry. Eventually, the boy succumbed to starvation, and the big hunter, in order to avoid a similar fate, devoured his mortal remains. This act of cannibalism, so abhorrent to Cree sensibilities, made him vulnerable to possession by the Wendigo, which imbued in its victims an irresistible craving for human flesh. In the autumn of 1878, Swiftrunner left his band at either Long Lake or Athabasca Landing, the latter lying on the Athabasca River about 80 miles or 130 kilometers north of Fort Edmonton, and headed into the forest to hunt and trap with his family, as was Cree custom. Accompanying him was his wife Charlotte, their 6 children, his brother, or perhaps his brother-in-law, and his mother, or perhaps his mother-in-law. Contemporary sources do not agree on the particular stretch of wilderness in which Swiftrunner laid his trapline. Father Leduc, who heard Swiftrunner's confession, wrote that the native had encamped about 80 miles north of St. Albert, in the boreal forest of what is now Cross Lake Provincial Park, just south of the Athabasca River. Fred Bagley, who received his information from fellow Northwest Mounted Police officers who were involved in Swiftrunner's case, placed the natives' camp in the wilderness just 30 miles from Fort Saskatchewan. Both Jean d'Artigue and J.P. Turner claimed that Swiftrunner made his winter camp on the left bank of Sturgeon Creek, now the Sturgeon River, a tributary of the North Saskatchewan, which lies no more than 12 miles northwest of Fort Saskatchewan at its furthest point. And contemporary newspaper articles placed the natives' trapline 50 miles north of the Edmonton area, or alternatively in the Moose Hills, nearly 100 miles to the east. Taken together, these various sources seem to point to the 60-mile stretch of wilderness between Athabasca Landing and present-day Gibbons, Alberta, as the likely setting of Swiftrunner's winter camp and the site of his skin-crawling crimes. All sources agree that, in the spring of 1879, Swiftrunner appeared alone at a Cree encampment on Manawan Lake, known at the time as Egg Lake, located about 15 miles northwest of St. Albert. When asked why his family had not come with him, the hunter explained that his mother and brother had set out on their own the previous February, when game became scarce, that his children had all subsequently perished in the woods from starvation, and that his wife had shot herself in despair. He told the same tragic tale to the missionaries at southerly St. Albert, on the shores of what the Cree called Big Lake shortly thereafter. Tragedies like that which Swift Runner claimed to have experienced were not unheard of in the boreal wilderness, where big game often proved a fickle source of sustenance. The story might have been believable were it not for the teller's robust constitution. Swift Runner had clearly not suffered the ravages of starvation that he claimed had gnawed away at his family that winter. On the contrary, he actually appeared well fed. As his father-in-law put it at his trial, he did not look very poor or thin, as if he had been starving. Even more troubling was Swift Runner's behavior. According to Fred Bagley, the big hunter took a special interest in the orphaned native children whom the St. Albert missionaries had taken under their wing, whose parents had perished in a smallpox epidemic that had swept through the country some years before. Swift Runner regaled the orphans with tales of his fine camp in the woods, and offered to take them to it, a proposal which the missionaries wisely declined. Alarmed by the hunter's strange story, appearance, and conduct, rendered doubly disturbing by the ominous nightmares that he claimed haunted his sleep at night, the missionaries of St. Albert alerted the Mounties at Fort Saskatchewan, telling them that they suspected something sinister had befallen Swift Runner's family. On the orders of Superintendent William Jarvis, Sergeant Dick Steele, the younger brother of the more famous Mountie Sam Steele, arrested Swift Runner and brought him to Fort Saskatchewan for interrogation. There, the hunter repeated the story he had told the missionaries and his fellow Cree, maintaining that he only managed to avoid the fate of his family members by boiling and eating his moose skin teepee. Unconvinced, Jarvis tasked a 3-man crew with accompanying Swift Runner to his old winter camp so that they could inspect the bones of his wife and children. The party of 3 included Sub-Inspector Sever Gagnon, Staff Sergeant Dr. George Herchmer, and a Métis scout and interpreter named George Washington Brazeau. The party shackled Swift Runner, sat him in Brazeau's Red River cart, and headed north into the wilderness. After riding for about 30 miles through prairie, boreal forest, and half-frozen muskeg, the Mounties realized that Swift Runner was leading them astray, evidently reluctant to take them to his old camp. Brazeau, the Métis scout, suggested that the policemen might solve their conundrum by feeding the prisoner a sort of truth serum famous on the Canadian frontier. That evening, while sitting around the campfire, the Mounties boiled a pot of tea, mixed liberally with plug tobacco, concocting a potent beverage which the Cree called Muskiki Washboy, or medicine tea. They fed this elixir to Swift Runner, who suddenly became very talkative. Coaxed by Gagnon, who feigned belief in his story, the intoxicated prisoner told the Mounties that he had been unable to bury his family members on account of the frozen winter earth, and had instead covered their bodies with spruce boughs, unfortunately leaving them vulnerable to the predations of bears and wolves. Before slipping into a drunken stupor, he promised to take them to their grave the following day. The next morning, wrote Fred Bagley in his article, while still under the influence, true to his promise, the prisoner led the party towards the thickest part of the bush. As he drew near the edge of it, he stopped short, threw back his head, and gave vent to a long, wolf-like howl. Sub-Inspector Gagnon looked at him sharply and murmured, "Ha, we're getting warm." Gagnon gave orders to search the immediate vicinity, and before long, Swift Runner's abandoned camp was discovered. Bagley described the camp as being located in a small clearing on an island in the middle of a large patch of muskeg, easily accessible as it was still partly frozen. Some contemporary newspaper articles, on the other hand, claimed that the Cree had made his winter home in a cave at the base of a hill. The first piece of evidence which gave the lie to Swift Runner's story was his moosehide teepee, which had not been boiled and eaten, as the native had claimed, but was rather folded and draped neatly over a tree branch, along with some of the natives' traps. The Mounties then stumbled upon the remains of Swift Runner's old campfire, where the hideous extent of his crimes were made appallingly clear. Scattered haphazardly about the epicenter of the camp were boiled human bones. The fragments of desiccated meat, which still clung to these sad remains, bore unmistakable traces of human teeth marks. The femurs and other long bones had all been smashed open, and the marrow sucked out. Amid these dismembered skeletons were hair, clothing, and 8 human skulls, also boiled, some of which had been smashed open with a tomahawk. The crania had been cleaved in such a manner as to lend the impression that the perpetrator had endeavored to extract the brains. One of the skulls, the tiny remains of an infant girl, was filled with a half-finished piece of needlework, which had evidently been stuffed inside through one of the eye sockets. In the ashes of the old campfire sat a pile of rotting, half-charred entrails. To complete the hellish scene, the trunks of nearby trees were streaked with greasy finger marks, evoking the scene of a gluttonous, cannibalistic feast held in the dead of winter, when the ragged rib cages and skeletal limbs discarded throughout the camp were still fresh enough to resemble the living human beings to whom they once belonged. They found other things, Bagley wrote in his article, things so gruesome and nauseating that they are unfit to be recorded here. Their senses reeling, the Mounties confronted Swiftrunner with this lurid evidence of cannibalism and demanded an explanation. The hunter continued to maintain that his family had died of starvation, but admitted that he had dined on their corpses, only to sustain his own life. He then told the policeman that about 1.5 miles from that spot, they would find the grave of his young teenage son, the eldest of his children, who had been the first to die. Since he himself had not been in the last stages of starvation at the time his son died, he had not been obliged to eat him as he did the others. The Mounties followed Swiftrunner's directions and found the boy's emaciated body buried where he said it would be. They then collected the 8 skulls scattered about the main camp, along with some of the bones, and buried the rest of the remains on the spot. Upon the party's return to Fort Saskatchewan, Swiftrunner was brought into a room in which his family's bones were laid out on a table and was interrogated at length. Rather than displaying fear or remorse, the hunter seemed to regard the whole situation as a big joke. When asked to identify the skulls, he casually stuck his fingers into the eye sockets of one of the larger ones. "This is my wife," he said with a merry chuckle. Eventually, Swiftrunner confessed that his family had not in fact died of starvation, but that he had killed and eaten them. Although the policeman had recovered 8 skulls from his old campsite, not including that of his eldest son, he steadfastly maintained that he had only killed and eaten his wife and 5 of his children. His 6th child, his eldest son, and the first of the family to die, had succumbed to starvation, a fact which Gagnon and Herchmer had verified. He refused to disclose the identities of the 7th and 8th skulls, saying only that his mother and brother had split off from their group before the killing began, and that he did not know what became of them. Swiftrunner would later repeat his chilling confession to Father Hippolyte Leduc 3 days before his execution, presumably in the Cree language. With the hunter's permission, Leduc later submitted the confession for publication in the press. His transcript of the Cree statement reads, "We were camped in the woods, about 80 miles from here. In the beginning of the winter, we had not much to suffer. Game was plenty. I killed many moose and 5 or 6 bears, but about the middle of February, I fell sick, and to complete our misfortune, those with me could find nothing to shoot. We had soon to kill our dogs, and lived on their flesh while it lasted. Having recovered a little from my sickness, I traveled to a post of the Hudson's Bay Company on the Athabasca River, and was assisted by the officer in charge, and returned to my camp with a small amount of provisions. That did not last us long. We all, that is my mother, wife, and 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls, besides my brother and I, began to feel the pangs of hunger. My brother made up his mind to start with my mother in search of some game. Starvation became worse and worse. Many days we had nothing to eat. I advised my wife to start with the children and follow on the snow the tracks of my mother and brother, who perhaps had been lucky enough to kill a moose or bear since they left us. For my part, though weak, I hoped that remaining alone I could support my life with my gun. All my family left me, with the exception of a little boy, 10 years of age, who obstinately refused to leave me. I remained many days with my boy without finding any game, and consequently without having a mouthful to eat. One morning, I got up early. Suddenly, an abominable thought crossed my mind. My son was lying down close to the fire, fast asleep. Pushed by the evil spirit, I took my gun and pointed it at the poor innocent. While turning my head away, I shot him. The ball entered the top of his skull. Still, he breathed. I began to cry, but what was the use? Impossible now to recall him to life. I then took my knife and sunk it twice into his side. Alas, he still breathed, and I picked up a stick and killed him with it. I then satisfied my hunger by eating some of his flesh and lived on it for some days, extracting even the marrow from his bones. Some days afterwards, in wandering through the woods, unfortunately I met my wife and children. I said to them that my son had died of starvation, but I remarked immediately that they suspected the frightful reality. They then told me that they had not seen either my mother or brother. No doubt both have died of starvation, otherwise they would have been heard of, as it is now 7 months since then. 3 days after joining my family, the oldest of my boys died. We dug a grave with an axe and buried him. We were then reduced to boil some pieces of our leather tent, our shoes, and buffalo robes in order to keep ourselves alive. I discovered soon that my family wanted to leave me for fear of meeting the same fate as my boy. One morning, I got up early, and I don't know why. I was mad. It seems to me that all the devils had entered my heart. My wife and children were asleep around me. Pushed by the evil spirit, I took my gun, and placing the muzzle against her chest, I shot her. I then, without any delay, took my hatchet and massacred my 3 little girls. There was now but one boy, 7 years old, surviving. I awoke him and told him to melt some snow for water at once. The poor child was too much weakened by long fasting to make any reflection on the frightful spectacle under his eyes. I took the bodies of my little girls and cut them up. I did the same with the corpse of my wife. I broke the skulls and took out the brains, and broke up the bones in order to get the marrow. My little son and I lived for 7 or 8 days on the flesh, I eating the flesh of my wife and children, and he the flesh of his mother and sisters. At length, I left there all the bones, and started with the last of my family. Snow began to melt. Spring had commenced. Ducks arrived and flew in every day around us, and I could find enough to live upon, but I felt reluctant to see people. I then told my son that after some days we would meet people. They would know very soon that I am a murderer, and they will certainly make me die. As to you, there is no fear. Say all you know. No harm will be done to you. One day I had killed many ducks. I was a few miles from Egg Lake, where some relations of mine lived. I was sitting at the campfire when I told my son to go and fetch something 5 or 6 paces off. At that moment, the devil suddenly took possession of my soul, and in order to live longer far from people, and to put out of the way the only witness to my crimes, I seized my gun and killed the last of my children, and ate him as I did the others. Swiftrunner was tried for the murder of his family in the summer of 1879, barely evading Indian justice at the hands of his Cree relatives, who resolved to dismember and cremate him if he managed to escape the Mountie jail, that method of interment being the only sure way to prevent a Wendigo from returning from the dead. The jurors included 3 English-speaking Métis and 4 white men, all of whom were fluent in the Cree language. Presiding over the trial was Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Richardson, a British-born militia commander and stipendiary magistrate, who would later try Métis revolutionary Louis Riel and rebel Cree chief Big Bear in the aftermath of the 1885 Northwest Rebellion. During the trial, certain lurid details of Swiftrunner's crimes emerged, some of which conflict with the confession the cannibal would later give to Father Leduc. As J.P. Turner put it in his 1950 History of the Northwest Mounted Police, he had forced one of his boys to kill a younger brother and cut him up, and this one he had eaten. He had then killed his baby by hanging it to a lodgepole, and while at his supper, had pulled the baby's legs to hasten its strangulation. He also confessed that he had done away with his mother-in-law, who he acknowledged was a bit tough. It was said by neighboring Indians that his brother had met the same fate. What made his act even more barbarous was the fact that while he was indulging in his ghastly orgy, he had plenty of dried meat hanging around the camp. On August 8, 1879, Judge Richardson sentenced Swiftrunner to be hanged at Fort Saskatchewan on December 20th of that year. In true native fashion, the hunter was said to have received news of his fate with stoic indifference. Swiftrunner spent the remainder of his days locked away in Fort Saskatchewan. In his article, Fred Bagley implied that, until the bitter end, the big Cree hunter never shook the craving for human flesh that he had developed in the far north on that fateful hunting trip years before. Frenchie, he wrote, a huge and particularly well-nourished member of our troop, was a constant source of merriment to the prisoner. Each time the constable entered the guardroom, the Indian's saucer-like eyes gloated over the corpulent form, his lips parted in a broad grin. Wah wah, you would make fine eating. There must be that much, holding up 3 fingers, fat on your ribs. Kaki Sikuchin took a great fancy to me, either because I could talk to him in Cree, or, horrid thought, because I was then young and tender. In consideration of the many striking similarities between the Wendigo legend and Roman Catholic demonology, which this author has explored in a previous piece, it is perhaps worth noting that, according to Father Leduc, Swiftrunner wholeheartedly accepted the Roman Catholic faith in the months preceding his execution, moved in particular by Leduc's recitation of the story of the penitent thief from the Gospel of Luke. He received the Catholic sacraments of reconciliation, Holy Communion, and the anointing of the sick, without exhibiting any of the classic signs of demonic possession, and in Leduc's estimation, died a virtuous Christian death. In their book, folklorists Chad Lewis and Kevin Lee Nelson point out that historians today do not agree on the location of Swiftrunner's final resting place. Some believe that his corpse was unceremoniously interred in what would one day become the Fort Saskatchewan jail cemetery. Others, citing contemporary newspaper articles, believe it was hastily buried in the snow outside the fort. This author, admittedly without any real evidence to support his theory, aside from a cursory knowledge of traditional Cree belief, proposes a third possibility, namely that Swiftrunner's body was retrieved by his relations and treated in the manner befitting a Wendigo demoniac, that is, dismembered and incinerated, so that his revenant could never return to torment the living. In the century and a half following Swiftrunner's execution, various scholars have puzzled over the psychological forces that compelled the Cree hunter to butcher and eat his family, thereby profaning one of the most sacrosanct taboos in Cree society. One of the earliest attempts to psychoanalyze this enigmatic Canadian serial killer appeared in a nameless article in the January 15th, 1880 issue of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. While overlooking historic acts of First Nations cannibalism committed in martial rituals, the piece nonetheless accurately illustrates how gravely Swiftrunner's actions violated his people's moral code. Ordinarily, the journalist wrote, an Indian's affection for his children transcends anything known to civilized life. He is also a kind and devoted husband. It is difficult to understand how Swiftrunner, though on the verge of starvation, could have brought himself to the gastronomical contemplation of his family. The North American Indian abhors the idea of eating human flesh and regards his dead with a superstitious reverence that cannot be shaken. In his operation, Swiftrunner developed a perversion of every instinct of an Indian. He overcame his natural affection for those dependent upon him, and then overcame every superstition of his soul. The only reasonable deduction is that the man was insane, so if Swiftrunner was non-compos, his conduct is explicable on that basis, while if he were sane, there is no satisfactory solution of his wide departure from the dominant and rigid instincts of Indian nature. Some anthropologists, like the aforementioned Lou Moreno, argue that Swiftrunner's horrific crimes were simply the actions of a desperate man, driven to commit the unthinkable by the overwhelming pangs of starvation. Others, like American anthropologists Charles Bishop and Robert A. Brightman, have ascribed Swiftrunner's cannibalistic killing spree to a hypothetical mental disorder unique to the Cree and Algonquin, which they call Wendigo psychosis. As Brightman put it in his article, The Wendigo in the Material World, published in the August 1988 issue of Ethnohistory, the phrase Wendigo psychosis refers in academic literature to an Algonquian-specific psychiatric disorder, whose sufferers experienced and acted upon obsessional cannibalistic urges. Culturally presupposed beliefs in Wendigo transformation have been understood as components of the disorder, causing both sufferers and their companions to identify psychiatric syndromes as signs of an inevitable, monstrous condition. One last perspective we would be unwise to discount is that of Swift-Runner's kinsman, the 19th century Plains Cree of the North Saskatchewan and Assiniboine rivers. Although few contemporary pieces make any mention of this fact, it is absolutely certain that Swift-Runner's friends and family members would have regarded his cannibalistic rampage as undeniable proof that he had indeed been possessed by the Wendigo, the evil, man-eating spirit of the North. Whatever motivation lay behind them, the horror of Swift-Runner's crimes continued to echo throughout history, perpetuating in Canada's cultural memory the image of that ravenous demon the Cree call the Wendigo.